Hello and welcome to Dateline London. The United States and peace, or rather the obvious lack of it in the Middle East. The balance between security and snooping and the epidemic of type 2 diabetes. Does Britain's National Health Service have an answer? My guests today are Nabila Ramdani, who's a French-Algerian journalist, Agnès Poirier of Marianne, Michael Goldfarb of globalpost.com, and Alex Dean of Conservative Home. Very good to see you. Well, the killings of 3 Israeli teenagers and then a young Palestinian boy. Rockets fired into Israel, bombing attacks on Gaza. Then, after a few days, the United States announced it would seek to broker a ceasefire. Is Washington asleep when it comes to the world's most intractable quarrel? I mean, you know, you may say we don't look to Russia, we don't look to the EU, we don't look to Tony Blair, so at least people still look to Washington for some guidance on this. But they've been incredibly slow.
But, Gavin, what can they do? I mean, in the end, you know, you ask the question, I could ask the question back. What is it really that Washington can do? I mean, one of the things that is, it's sadly clear after 45 years, is that Washington can bring a tremendous amount of pressure to bear when both sides are interested in talking. You can get a deal like you had between Begin and Sadat, and then Sadat gets shot. You can have a deal like you had between Rabin and Arafat. Rabin gets shot. You can invite Ehud Barak and Arafat to talks, and within 18 months, Barak is voted out of office. How far can Washington go? And in this particular case, don't forget that John Kerry became Secretary of State, said, my goal is to, you know, create new talks. He failed utterly. But is his failure his, or is it because both sides are now in a place with political leadership that actually, in a very perverse sense to those of us who are outside it, get something out of this? It's clear that Netanyahu gets something out of this. I mean, we didn't mention much. Avigdor Lieberman, his foreign minister, broke up, it's not the coalition, but the voting bloc he had with the Likud several days before this advance began. Hamas had joined forces with Fatah, and this was going to change the whole picture, but not really, because Hamas felt then it had made itself isolated, so it got something out of launching rockets that were only going to bring forth this response. This response is much more about the rockets that have landed and the escalation from these 2 deaths. And really, I don't think any outside force can get in there and do anything. It is really down to the 2 peoples involved to say, our political leadership is leading us down a corridor from which the only exit is in a coffin. And until that happens, the U.S. has no role.
But you seem, Nabila, from the outside, that perhaps one would say that both sides are looking for some kind of victory, where victory is clearly impossible. I mean, the Palestinians are not going to go away, and Israel is not going to go away, and so somehow they've got to deal with each other.
Well, to answer your preliminary question, I would contend that Washington is not asleep, but pretending to be. Relaxed indifference has been America's default position as far as the Arab-Israeli conflict is concerned for years. And Washington may be concerned about the murdering of Palestinians, who knows? But it is far more concerned about the maintenance of the Israeli security state, because a great deal of American power, American firepower, and indeed American money make sure that it is as strong as possible. And Obama knows that Israel's Iron Dome, its rockets, its bombers, its tankers, its nuclear warheads, its missile defenses, and the rest of it will keep Israel well ahead of Palestinian rockets, and it will continue the killing. Look at the figures. We've just heard the news. More than 100 Palestinians have been killed, the vast majority of them innocent civilians, women and children. More than 700 people have been injured. There's a humanitarian crisis going on, with Israeli MPs now calling for electricity, water supplies and medical supplies to be cut out. And in the face of such a grim reality, we're hearing the Prime Minister of Israel saying that he will not be stopped by international pressure, and he's threatening ground offensive. This is a display, a sinister display of smug invincibility. And
but if the Palestinians, if the Hamas people stop firing rockets, would that not be a game changer?
Gavin,
I mean, it seems to be a zero-sum game.
It is easy to portray Hamas as a terrorist organization, and nobody would condone firing rockets into Israel under any circumstances, but the threat of Israeli life is met with the actual loss of considerable civilian lives in Gaza,
Nabila,
and nobody should underestimate the abject savagery which underpins this round of violence.
The sequence of events, though,
and the worst of it comes from Israel.
The sequence of events was the 3 Israeli teenagers were abducted.
Palestinians would dispute that. The sequence of events, the immediate sequence of events, can even go back to May, when 3 Palestinian teenagers were shot dead at a checkpoint.
My point is,
we don't even know.
At a certain point, listen,
Michael, we
Nabila,
don't even know who murdered the Israeli teenagers.
Look. Listen, I've heard the Hamas spokesman already infer that this was somehow an Israeli action to kill 3 children. No, this is not going to help. But my point was that when
finish, Nabila, and then I'll come back to you.
When the Palestinian teenager, in revenge, was abducted from Shuafat and murdered in a terrible way, there was this global abhorrence. And rather than taking that moment, the Hamas leadership, when it had actually, the world has had 48 hours, starts lobbing in the rockets. What is the purpose of doing that?
That is a fair point. But even if Palestinians, they're still unknown criminals, those behind the killings, the gruesome murder of 3 Israeli youths. Even if Palestinians were behind it, surely the only democracy in the Middle East, as it likes to call itself, should bring those criminals, deal with them through the rule of law and due process, and not have Netanyahu call for actual blood and revenge at the very funeral of those teenagers.
Alex?
I don't really think, and I'm not Israeli or not Jewish, I'm not Palestinian, and as an outsider to that conflict, I don't really, as an observer, accept the idea of equivalence, or that there's equivalence in the death count, as was just implied. Israel shields its civilians with military tools.
Precisely. Where are the shelters in Gaza? I mean,
forgive me, I wasn't finished. My point was to contrast what Israel does to shield civilians with its military tools, in contrast with Hamas, who shield terror tools with civilians. That is, they push civilians to the front, they put them on tops of buildings when Israelis threaten strikes. They would prefer to have civilians and have their deaths.
Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. There is nowhere else to go.
But there is nowhere else to go in the whole of, when you talk about getting outside of Gaza.
They're targeting journalists, Alex. Colleagues of mine died in the last round of violence.
Israel has developed tools that display by sound, by sight, by noise, that they're about to strike a building. And Hamas pushes people back into those areas so as to ensure that there are civilian casualties.
What do you make of it?
Apology for cutting you out. I just wanted to agree with you, actually. Because Israel is a democracy. Hamas is a terrorist organization. It's easy to say, but it's the truth. I mean, it's a fact. And also now, you said, is Washington asleep? Is the Arab League asleep? What about this, the Arab silence? Right. It's deafening. I mean, we're talking about the West.
They call for a meeting with the UN.
There's not much we can do, actually. I mean, yesterday President Hollande was on the phone with Netanyahu, and, that's all they can do, actually. Mahmoud Abbas. That's all they can do, be on the phone to them and say, please, calm down. Please, a lot of people are being killed.
Just to go back to Michael's point, because I think it was a very interesting one, it does serve quite a lot of interest to see this conflict continue, does it not? It actually serves quite a lot of people. It serves some people within Israel and some people within the Palestinian camp too.
Well, let's make no mistake about what this current crisis is about. And it's not tit for tat between Hamas and Israel. It's about the wider picture. It's about a free and independent state for the Palestinians. It's about the brutality of military occupation, 47 years, the longest in modern history. It's about apartheid policies exemplified by that porous wall separating communities. It's about illegal land grabbing and illegal settlements built on that stolen land, effectively. It's about the day-to-day humiliation of oppression. It's about the effective siege of Gaza. Israel effectively still controls all the key to what David Cameron called an open-air prison. Its land borders, its airs,
But it's
everything.
also...
Do you agree with quite a lot of it?
Listen, in Israel, the voices, I'm going to get emails about this from friends, the peace camp is still there, and it's there in the diaspora. But it's also about the complete failure of several generations of Palestinian politicians to deal with what is real and what is possible within the context.
Palestinian politicians have given 78% to Israel of historical Palestine.
Nabila,
it's about time that Israel was criminalized and treated like an international pariah for its continuous murderous policies.
Nabila, listen. Possibly the stupidest thing the UN has ever done was to grant to the PLO this status of being the sole legitimate voice of the Palestinian people. Because what it did is it condemned the Palestinian people in this occupation to a politics built on a one-party state. There was no possibility of dissident voices. All of the money that was coming from international organizations went through Fatah,
and when
the PLO.
You have unity government, alliances between different factions.
No, it doesn't work.
It
doesn't work that way, and it hasn't worked that way. And that's why there hasn't been. I'm sorry to carry on, Gavin, but it gets to me in this way. There had to have been a better way beside violence. When one is, as you have so accurately portrayed,
international condemnation.
No, that means nothing.
Of course it
Satyagraha.
does. There are international bodies that deal with the law.
India, and Satyagraha worked. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act in America. It would have served the Palestinian people better to take a non-violent path and accept the pain that comes with it than to continue to fight and accept
in the face of climbing casualties, in the face of climbing and harrowing casualties. We are hearing somebody talking about Palestinian violence. This is what this is all about, the PR spin on it.
OK, we'll leave it there. Now, the British Parliament this week decided to rush through new legislation to protect the security of the United Kingdom, or to snoop on people, if you prefer, or perhaps both. Do we feel any safer in our beds knowing that telephone and internet records will not be destroyed and that they could possibly help prevent terrorist outrages? There's a number of parts to this, but one is this haste to push things through, which a number of MPs who may agree to the legislation, they're very, very worried about this, and that's a fair point.
Yeah, I agree with that point. I think that knee-jerk legislation is generally bad. Knee-jerk legislation in the face of a court decision which tells you you've been doing something wrong, which tries to plaster over the accusation you're doing something wrong and let you carry on doing it, is, I think, very bad. We are increasingly becoming, I think, a surveillance society. And that's just not my words. That was the response of the Law Society to the current proposals, who are concerned about the point you make, that legislation concerning individual freedom and privacy ought to be subject to proper scrutiny. We are told that this is emergency legislation, to which I think any right-thinking person might answer, where's the emergency? That means that you need to tell Cabinet about this on 8 a.m. on a Thursday, put the legislation about later that day, have a reshuffle speculation over the weekend and put the whole bill through on Tuesday. There is nothing that merits or warrants ramming through a bill like that, and in the absence of compelling arguments for it, one fears that it's the accumulation of greater powers to the state very quickly.
And the other thing that people worry about is this whole question of we have to trust the intelligence services up to a point, is what we're told, and yet when the sense of oversight, ramming things through for emergency reasons when people wonder where the emergency is, as Alex says,
that causes real problems. The average citizen, like us, we are just placed between a rock and a hard place, So where's the emergency? Perhaps it's secret and we obviously don't have access to it. Now, are we living in the UK in a blanket surveillance society? I'm not sure we are. If you look at the justice system, which is different, very different in Britain or in France, especially as far as terrorism legislation is concerned. In France, the judges, the investigative judges, have access to material that they don't even disclose to the suspect and their lawyers, whereas here, there's much more transparency, for instance. So it's not all that bad.
Once you're accused and in the criminal justice system.
Of course, but still, you have access to evidence. Well, in Germany and France, you don't.
Well, you still can't get access to tapping evidence in this country. You can't use phone surveillance or tapping in court in the way you can elsewhere.
And now the EU Court Justice decision, or not decision, but they just said that the retention of data should be proportional rather than... So they were not discussing the actual tool. It's an incredible tool to be having, this access to all
of your
this
phone
data.
calls, all of your email data, your web browsing history. Even Labour, after 9/11, at the height of their authoritarianism, never pushed this through. But now we have a government with two parts, both elected on a mandate of enhancing individual freedom, who promised us a freedom bill at the beginning of their term, giving us this. I mean, as a Conservative, I take no comfort in the fact that all the parties seem to agree on this. In fact, I find it rather alarming.
Can I play devil's advocate here and just say, look, we know the increased security measures at the airports. If there's not an emergency, that is because it is said by those who oversee the intelligence services, they've been terrific at it. That's because they've got the powers adequate to the job. And that destroying records, actually, frankly, if you're not up to something, there's nothing to worry about. That's the argument that William Hague and other people have made.
Well, I think we used to talk about the big society, now it's the surveillance society. And my personal view is that government agency can pretty much have all kinds of information about us already, and that emergency laws are just a way of make it sound vaguely legitimate. In the old days, you would notice a click on the line when you were being bugged, but now it's obviously far more sophisticated. You know, internet service providers, companies like Facebook and Twitter have all sorts of information about you already, and so the government contends, and David Cameron contends, why not the government? And he's using, he bandies around the word terrorism to say, well, this is aimed at protecting people from, terrorist attacks. And in principle, any measure aimed at protecting, a country's citizens is to be welcomed. But the reality is that kind of laws, and especially when they're rushed through, are, as far as politicians are concerned, and David Cameron in particular, it transcends civil liberties. But very often these laws actually stifle human rights and indeed stigmatise communities. And let's be honest, especially young Muslim men.
I completely agree. But not only is it contrary to general principle, it's specifically unlawful, given what we learned from the European Court of Justice. If you strip out the individual threats or accusations behind these bills and look at the principle of what's happening, create fear, give hope, I'm the hope, I've got the answer, can't tell you what the fear is right now, it's too sensitive, but give me these powers and I'll deal with it. It's the mandate of every dictator.
And it never seems to be
there's another question.
A lot of people would say that's the Patriot Act as well in America.
Someone was talking from the government about, the United States has proved that you can have laws of this.
Are you kidding?
Yeah, the Washington Post had a story this week about for every million bits of information they collect, maybe one is related to anything related to a possible terror suspect. But the efficacy is what we don't know, and it's open to question. Yes, since 7/7, mercifully, there hasn't been a major terrorist outrage. One or two have been stopped. Now, I did a huge documentary about terrorism in this country before 7/7, and I'm convinced that good old-fashioned police work, that really good community relations in the Muslim community is the most effective way to stop this kind of event even happening. And maybe why so many young men are not even so many, dozens of young men are going to Syria.
It doesn't take many.
Because why do you need to collect data on everyone? And, the old thing, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, what's the problem? Well, the problem is, and this is a little off topic, is last week there was a big story, 2 weeks ago. Facebook had been manipulating
research.
For research. They had been manipulating its users' emotions by filtering out bad Facebook posts and putting only the happy ones in your news feed. And suddenly people were putting happy news feeds up. And there is no justification for it at all.
And it's like saying, that you're going to bring in, special powers to cope with a domestic crime wave against people who, with burglars and arrest everybody who's likely to look vaguely like a burglar. Of course, you can't use that kind of legislation to deprive people of their most basic rights.
I agree with deprivation of rights, which is effectively what part of this is, and we're jettisoning big rights in return for temporary promises of liberty, which Benjamin Franklin had something to say about. But I wanted to agree with your point about old-fashioned police work, which gets harder with legislation like this for two reasons. One, you have fewer resources in any system of finite funding to do actual police work if you're spending more money on surveillance of everyone all the time, just in case. But secondly, if you're trying to find the needle in the haystack, which was your point about finding the individuals, why grow the haystack? Why accumulate information and material about everyone all the time, just in case? Good surveillance is proportionate, aimed at specified individuals for a specified purpose, rather than watching everyone all the time.
But, are we not getting what we deserve in a way? I mean, we're living in the tyranny of transparency. So, we've got the legislation that goes with it. Shall we go back to before the internet and before the, we're addicted to our iPhones.
What government does with the information is not transparent. In fact, the Americans are better at being transparent about what they do with their surveillance than we are. We've got the worst of all worlds. We're transparent about what they collect. We don't have any transparency about what they do with it.
OK, let's move on, because so many British people are now officially fat that we've seen a huge upsurge in cases of type 2 diabetes and of those who may soon develop it. The disease eats up 10% of the National Health Service budget. Is the answer to provide free weight loss surgery to those at risk, to encourage more people to diet, or even to tax fatty and sugary foods? So what do you make of this?
Well, I think perhaps the most logical thing to do is to make sure that healthy food is cheap, that people are educated about eating healthy food, and that people exercise, and that, in principle, should be the simple way. And I firmly believe that the key to that is education. To take, for example, in France, legislation about obesity comes from the government. The government fiercely interfere with that kind of into guiding into how people should, eat healthily, to the point that it's in the curriculum in France. Lots of efforts are made in relation to, junk food, even fast food. McDonald's in France are different. They're more healthy than anywhere else in the world. You have efforts in vending machines, for example, selling apples and water instead of fizzy drinks, and you don't have that culture of buy one get one free type of thing, or when you go and buy your newspaper, you don't get a free chocolate bar with it.
And that's interesting, because it retains a sense of choice rather than...
Well, it's an education, but it's also a culture. So, it takes generations and generations. When you know the state of the NHS, is it, what's the plan to invest massively in gastric bans for all, in order to, 5 years later, cuts on diabetes treatments? Because
the idea is it would save money.
Exactly.
That's what's driving. That's allegedly driving it, isn't it?
But then why don't we tax, fatty and sweet products?
But the argument is made that if you're an alcoholic, you're treated on the NHS. If you're a drug addict, you're treated on the NHS. If you're clinically obese, you should be treated on the NHS, and that may mean, however much you may try to stimulate what people eat, sometimes you just need to have the gastric banned because that stops them. That's the argument.
Yeah, the reality, that argument doesn't work, because Diabetes UK tells us people affected by this kind of problem, where their body mass index is 35 or over, which is apparently the type of person who should get this kind of operation, numbers about 850,000 people in this country. You simply cannot put that extra burden of operations into the NHS and have it work. So, point one, it's not going to happen. But so let's step back from the fact that it won't happen.
But we have got a problem still. There is still clearly a problem.
We may have a problem, but in any free, educated society, the number of fat adults is going to very closely correlate with the number of adults who've chosen to be fat. We know that we should eat well and that we should exercise. We don't, because bad food tastes good and because we're lazy. That's why I've got a bit of a spare tyre. That's why individuals...
well, we should tax it. We tax alcohol.
But no, hang on. We ought... But that's evading the point, because rather than taking responsibility for our own choices, what you're encouraging is saying, don't worry, it's not your fault, the state will deal with it instead. We will infantilise people, turning adults into children.
But the state pays for your treatment anyway in the NHS. That is different from America.
A, arguably it shouldn't, but B, moreover, in the situation we've got, what you're doing is making individuals compulsorily pay, the taxpayer will have to compulsorily pay for the consequences of what an individual has voluntarily done, which is make themselves fat.
If it was only that simple, Nabila touched on this at the start. Look, this is more than just a question of people eating too much and then and learning to stop, or smoking and not smoking, or anything like that. The food chain, what we consume, is so corrupted now. What gets to our supermarket shelves is so full of stuff that will make people...
People don't know how fatty food's unhealthy for them.
Alex,
step away. Look at the explosion in obesity just in India and China, where you've had, in the last 25 years, these massive populations have moved to the cities, incredible growth in the middle class. People go to the supermarket now, they don't pull food out of the soil, and what they get is processed food, which is
but
full of sugar.
They have a choice whether to buy it or not.
Well, no, but do people have
sedentary lifestyles?
But do people have a choice? I mean, if you go into listen, if you live in my neighborhood, I have the best greengrocer in London, and I eat lots of fresh vegetables. I have a riding flat in a less well-off part of London. I've been living there the last week working on a project. I am stunned by how expensive fresh food is. And if you were living on the poverty line, if you were living a life where you had to work manual labor, 2 people in a household, 12 hours a day, believe me, the ready meal is the one that's going to be served to the kids.
So you disagree with Gavin, and you don't think people should tax that food even more, which would make it more expensive?
Well, I mean, I think that it's, I don't know how you tax something. Food is, unlike tobacco or alcohol, a necessity for life. I said at the start, the food chain, what gets to the supermarkets, is now so thoroughly corrupted that obesity is kind of built in to our societies because of what we're putting in our mouths and have no choice about.
The lunch bell is ringing or something, because we're going to have to end it there and I'll go and have a break. That's it for Dateline London for this week. We're back next week at the same time. Please do join us then. You can, of course, comment on the programme on Twitter at Gavin Esler. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.
Hello there. Our weekend weather like the pendulum of a clock, swinging back and forth, bringing different weather conditions for each day. So today, the wettest of the weather will be further west, humid with some sunshine in the east. For tomorrow, the pendulum swings the other way, the brightest of the weather further west, rather grey skies and damp to the east. So this has been the story so far, with a little bit of cloud just lingering across eastern England, but some sunny spells elsewhere. Weather fronts starting to push in from the Atlantic. That will increase the cloud, and also some rain as we move into the afternoon. The rain always heaviest then along the far northwest.